Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Tillapaugh, he, him, his pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of counselor education at California Lutheran University. Today, we have a great group of educational scholars who will be sharing their thoughts with us on action research. And I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a minute. Before they do, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Chris Linder from the University of Georgia, who has really inspired the idea of these flipped classroom recorded video chats on educational research. Today's panelists will be discussing their experiences as researchers engaged in participatory action research in educational contexts. Their work is really exciting and interesting, and I'm so pleased that they'll be able to share their insights with us and you today. At this point, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly with their name, gender pronouns, a little bit about themselves, and what they do as a researcher. And Cheryl, if you can start us off.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with both you and Erica. So my name is Cheryl Getz, she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Leadership Studies at the University of San Diego. I work with undergraduates, masters, and doctoral students, and I use a variety of different pedagogical approaches, which actually are aligned very well with my preferred research, which is action research, more aligned with a more lived action inquiry that I use in my teaching and also in my research. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that once we get going.
Great. Hi, I'm Erica Yamamura, and I'm an associate professor, and I coordinate our Student Development Administration Master's program. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and action research. Oh man, I think I've always been doing action research. I just didn't have a name for it until I started really working in a practitioner program, actually in a K-12 practitioner program that wanted to become P20. And then in my current student affairs program, I use it in almost all of my courses. And I think it's been most powerful learning for students, especially students who want to explore the community college context, which is a big part of our higher ed landscape up here in Seattle. So.
Awesome. And I know all of my students just got perked up by community colleges and their interest in that. So I'm excited for them to learn more from both of you. So, you know, again, the students in my class specifically who are going to be watching this, they are all folks who are higher ed focused, but also we have some folks who will be using these videos who are more school counseling based focused as well, and sort of cutting across the institution. And again, these are folks who are approaching the end of their academic experiences in our master's program, and learning the basics of these different methods. And so how would you explain action research to a student who may not be familiar with what that is? And maybe Erica, do you want to start us off for this one?
Sure. I would say the first thing is action research is fun. Because students, especially master's students, sometimes are afraid of the word research. When I think of action research, I think of really being problem solving, coming from that mentality, and improving practice. So, and in a really thoughtful and reflective way. And so, yeah, I think for me, that's a really important component. I also think for a lot of students who want to make these big changes, right, when they think of research, like I'm going to move the retention rate 50%, right? And I think when you start asking questions, when I do action research of a community partner, like what's going on, what are the issues, what information do you need, I think it changes students' mentality and thinking like, well, I can do this, I can be in conversation, I can use some of, you know, the research methods that I've learned, and I can see now how we can use all this information to really do something to positively impact students.
Cheryl, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Erica said, of course. One way that I like to describe it that might be a little bit different is using the metaphor of a fishbowl. And traditional research, you have a fishbowl with the fish swimming around, and the researcher is on the outside looking in at the fish. In action research, the researcher is in swimming with the fish, because the action research allows for the researcher to be part of the research. And in fact, I say it's, there's bias in all kinds of research, but we just pretend there isn't. But in action research, we claim it. We say there is bias, and actually the bias that we have, especially if we're doing research in our own organization, that bias is a really important piece of data that we want to share within the research process. And like Erica, it's fun because you're engaging in your own learning as well as others. So there's also a community element. If I'm doing research on my own organization, of course, there's my reflective piece, but then there's my interactions with the peers that I'm working with and others in the organization to address whatever the issue is within that organization. It's also, I think, important to mention that it's cyclical. So we talk a lot about the different cycles of action research, where there's a cycle of action, reflection, modification, and some kind of change. And Erica mentioned that there's always an element of change. It's an emancipatory kind of research where people are engaging with real life issues that impact them and the people that they're working with.
That's great. And so, again, knowing the both of you and what your sort of focus is and sort of the passions you have for social justice and emancipatory learning, I would imagine that that's part of the answer to the next question, but I'm going to let you all sort of speak to it directly. But what draws you to action research, and what about that method stands out to you in terms of maybe some of the topics that you've even explored? Cheryl, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'm very much drawn to the reflexivity in the action research. And then the second thing is working in community. So I find that students are more interested and more likely to participate in research when it's meaningful to them. And, we often get pushback about the navel gazing and too much reflection. And that can certainly happen. But if you don't understand yourself and your situation in your organization, or even yourself in the world, it's very hard to understand others. So the piece that I do appreciate the most is the reflexivity. And the ways in which that I've used that in my own research, I've done several studies where I'm reflecting on my own teaching. Teaching is an important part of the work that I do, and I teach the action research class. And in fact, I'm teaching a doctoral research class in a couple weeks. And we'll be using the class as an instrument for reflection. So we'll be learning about action research as we're doing action research. So the commitment is really digging deeply about how you understand yourself within the organization or the place of study, and how you're working with others and taking in the information and the feedback that they're giving you to look towards change. And then the last piece, again, is the emancipatory piece, that there is a possibility for doing work related to social justice and doing real meaningful work, because it has to engage the people in the process.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I want to take your doc class. Sounds like it's going to be a fun one, and I look forward to learning more. I definitely agree with Cheryl on so many fronts. I think for me, social justice is the key component. Our program, our master's program, that's what we say the core is. And so I think when you do action research and you do that deep reflection and you're asked to really engage authentically with the community, I think students are changed professionally, how they think of themselves as professionals, also how they think of different contexts. So I teach a community college class where I would say in my 7 years at Seattle U, the majority of students have never stepped foot on a community college campus. And so for them, a lot of the early learning is about reframing their deficit conceptions that they don't even know that they have about students before they get to campus. So I think really changing their understanding and from a justice standpoint to learn about different community college contexts. There's also a real practical benefit that I'm sure Cheryl has written on and others, but students get practical training. I mean, it's not just a conceptual activity where we're dreaming about, a solution, we're dreaming about this wonderful practice, although that's fun, right? I'm not going to deny that, but students get practical experience. It expands their network of professionals, mostly in good ways, institutional types. And for some of my students, they actually get employed. We'll do some kind of project and a community partner will say, you know what, I have this job opening and I think you'd be great at it. So students, we've seen more and more that employers want that direct experience working with students, and then they employ them quickly. It also keeps me updated on the field. Like, of course, I love to read the Chronicle. I love hearing reflections from students. But when you sit with a community partner, like that's what I spend a lot of my summers doing. What's new? What's troubling? What kind of questions are you asking yourself? Where's the resource strain? Where are the tensions? I mean, it really keeps me updated on the field, because I could read something in the Chronicle about a typical one, like an economic challenge, but how that plays out in one university context or another, and in the field looks really, really different typically. And lastly, I think an important part of work, especially in higher ed and student affairs, is we're never in it alone, even as a field. And so it builds community, and that's so, so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, you both have shared a lot of great insights in that, and sort of the possibilities that are emergent from these types of projects to sort of help students get a better sense from what they read in the textbook, which can sometimes be dry and not as fun as you've alluded to in terms of this approach. Could you maybe both walk us through a project that you used action research, and sort of walk us through the different stages of, like, how do you formulate a question that is around action research methodology, and then even like implementing that? I know you've both alluded to community and partnership, and that's important pieces, and even the reflexivity. But if you can sort of expand on that a little bit with some specifics, that would be helpful. And whoever would like to start first can start first.
I can go. There was a lot of questions embedded in that question, so remind me if I miss anything. I think what you're asking is what's the process? How do we get started? So I'm going to talk just a little bit about maybe the first 2 or 3 weeks of class. So I teach the action research class for our master students. Our master students are also all in higher education that want to take this class, and all of them have a required action research project that they have to complete. 80% of them are currently working in either full-time jobs or graduate assistant positions in higher education. So they naturally have a place for them to do their work. Some of them aren't, and we have to then go engage other community partners. But the very first place that we start is actually with their values. And we do a values exercise to have them reflect on what is it that they value. They want, how are their values aligned with their professional goals? Sometimes that process helps them see that they are or are not actually in a good fit position. So let's just consider that they are in a good position for further exploration. So they come to a set of values, and then they start thinking about some questions that they've had either about their own practice or that they've heard their colleagues or their supervisors talking about in their areas. What are some of the concerns? Often what comes up is, I'm right out of undergrad, I'm in a higher ed program, and they're asking me to advise students, and I think their model of advising is not very good. What do I do? So we, again, go back to what do you value? Why do you think that it's not working? What questions could you ask your colleagues and your students and your supervisors that would be helpful in helping you frame a question about maybe how you improve your practice or how your unit improves their advising model? And that's where they begin. They begin with questioning themselves and others. And the kinds of questions, we have 25 to 30 students going through the program each year. So we have a lot of questions. But the kinds of questions that come up are, how can I strengthen my advising practice while also helping the X unit, whatever unit is, develop a plan for the future of advising? Or one example that I have, one of our students who herself was struggling with stress related to wellness. And she's a young woman of color, and she wanted to talk with other women of color about this issue to see if that was something shared just by her or shared by others. So she just basically put out a call for people, are you interested in talking about this? People who were in our school. And she ended up with, I think, 8 or 9 other people who then together talked about what could they do to help each other discuss and explore how to manage stressful behaviors around microaggressions, stressful behaviors around, or stressful feelings around too much work. And they started a group, basically, who met, I think they met once every couple of weeks, and they came in with a question, or they came in with something that they wanted to explore, and they were able to explore together. And at the end of the semester, what she had was students telling her, how do we continue this? I know you're graduating, but can we get this implemented in our school? Could this be something that's permanent, so that we have an outlet, so that we have somewhere to go to talk about some of these issues? And then maybe we can plan, and that was her action step, and maybe for the future we could have another action step where this could be something larger than our school, because we have plenty of students who are struggling with these same issues. So it goes from a personal value to community questions, and to then the large, okay, so now what can we do together to address a change that might be helpful to address some of these questions that we have.
That's great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So at Seattle U, I just want to lay out a couple of contextual questions too, because I was listening to Cheryl thinking, that's so amazing. We're on the quarter system. So really we have 8 weeks for a class when you take out the first class presentations and typically a holiday, sometimes 2 in the middle. So I use more community-based research, but a project-based learning model. So I'll go to community partners in the summer and sort of negotiate a question that I think or they will provide input on what they need, the challenges that they're facing, and then I will try and frame a question that is doable within an 8-week time frame. And so one example is with the local community college system. I had a lunch meeting or a focus group, whatever you want to frame it as, with 4 different VPs or Chief Student Affairs Officers from different community colleges in the region, and they were all talking about veteran students. What are they doing? Here's this component going after a grant, connections that they have. We have a couple of military bases, some closer to other campuses, and so it ended up being, okay, so at the end of that conversation, I thought, okay, so clearly there's a need to understand veteran student context more. And so we co-created a question looking at what are the needs of veteran students and how can we help serve them so that they meet their own career goals. As you all know, in a community college, that's not necessarily transfer. Unlike at a 4-year, you want folks to graduate and to move on. So then in my courses, so in the community college course, I actually break students up into different groups, and one group will work with one particular community college. So really, as a class, I'm looking at the whole region, right? And we have all these different community colleges represented. But within each team, they're focused on one campus. So typically there's either a focus group, an interview, observation. So everyone is required to visit the campus. And I typically have them do it alone. I don't let them go in their little student affairs groups and mingle in the student center because I want them to experience community college like a typical community college student does. And so then they come back and then they discuss their observations and reflections in small group within their group setting. And then I also mix them up in between groups so that they can share their experiences with each other and see how they're similar or different. And then typically they, do the research piece, they interview and or present initial findings to a key stakeholder on campus. And then they do their final presentation and write up a report. One of the things that I've started to do now is to move those presentations to the actual campuses so that they don't do a class presentation at my university campus and then I translate that presentation to the stakeholder, but to actually have it showcased on their campus. And it's been a great experience for students. And so the results of that project 2 years ago is that in this region, almost all of the community colleges have hired a veteran navigator. Some of them are moving toward one-stop shops. And I have 2 students who actually are in those positions. So it was neat because they started, grad school trying to figure out what is it that they want to do, worked on a project, and then they actually ended up finding their passion and working based off doing a small class project.
Can I build on that, Dan?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, so that's great, and it would be really hard to do the 8 weeks. So I think the modifications you have are fantastic. We have a handful of students who are also at community colleges. So we have some are on our campus, some are at community colleges, and a couple things that you said. One about them finding that they have a new interest and or getting a job. We hear the same thing about the job. A lot of our students, when they get hired for jobs, and most of them do, they say, what the interviewer says, what you did with your action research, that's amazing that you were doing that kind of work you were doing as a student. So that is a real draw, I think, for people. But what's interesting about the community college ones, we had a student who, I can't remember the community college now, but she was working with some of the dreamers, the students, obviously it was a very anxious year. And she spent a whole year on it, on having conversations because they had so she started actually before the elections. So she had no idea that was going to come because it was the year before, the presidential elections I'm talking about. So she was trying to provide policies and procedures, and she understood that she had to talk with other community colleges to see what they were doing. So she did the same thing that you're describing. She got people together, she asked questions, and they collectively then put something together, and they created a new center, a Dreamer Center at her community college, and then she presented at all these national conferences. So it went from an idea that she had and a community that she was engaged with. It was actually a community that she's very close to, and she had an individual identity related to that. And she was very passionate about it, and it grew into something that really made a difference for the community colleges in her community college and the others in the area in San Diego too. So I really appreciate you talking about the ways in which once you're engaging with your community partners or others, that it really can turn into something fabulous because a lot of people will buy into it.
Absolutely.
Well, and it goes also, if you don't mind if I add a little bit, I think it goes back to that social justice oriented piece, right? And making this long-standing difference when students are successful. One of the ways I've mitigated this 8-week challenge is I teach 2 sections of the community college class. So the first quarter, students will start, and then based on those findings, the next group that comes in will continue. And then last year, we have a small group of students, usually just a handful, who do a practitioner-based research project. So it sounds actually more like what you get to do all year in your program, which is awesome. But they only get a quarter, and last year, I had them continue on the projects that they had started. So it was sort of the first time there was a whole year dedicated, and the quality was just so great. So I just want to add, I think, with doing things that are more longitudinal in nature too, whether it's an individual student or it's some kind of patchwork process like we have, I think can be more meaningful, not just for the community partner in the community, but also for students.
Yeah, great.
Absolutely. Well, and I think too, for me, the thing that I think is so interesting, especially when we think about in education, K through whatever, even including doctoral level or professional education, the cool part about action research to me, and this is what you're speaking about, is that it can be so easily sort of embedded in the work that you're already doing. I mean, it takes work, it takes time, certainly, but unlike a traditional sort of quant or qual or mixed methods approach, like I think there's a piece of, if you're already a reflective practitioner, scholar practitioner, then doing this type of work can easily be something that just helps you with your professional practice and answers those big questions that you might have in the profession. And that's what I think is really the coolest part of action research.
Mm-hmm.
When we think about sort of doing this, and sort of like, maybe I was just sort of got us into the question of advantage and disadvantages. What do you see as the advantages or disadvantages, if there are any, of doing action research work within education? Maybe Cheryl, if you don't mind starting.
Okay. I think we've talked about some of the advantages. The fact that you have an opportunity to reflect on your own practice. It's inclusive in the people who the research is with. You have collaborators versus subjects, and it addresses issues that are important to you, but also important to them. So it's not just a person doing a research on somebody else or on some other organization. And the emancipatory part, I think, is a very big advantage. You learn a lot about yourself. And I think through the process, I think we've talked about this a little bit, you develop meaningful relationships. Sometimes those turn into jobs, which is sometimes it turns into leadership action and change, and sometimes it's an opportunity for employment. I think some of the disadvantages, number one, it's not generalizable in the ways that other research is. The way I always talk about the generalizability is that it can be generalizable only to so whoever reads, hopefully you write something up and somebody else reads it, and then they make a decision about what they're going to do with it in their own context. That's the generalizability. It's not generalizable to all contexts. Much research isn't, but in particular action research, because you're in your own context. But whoever is reading your work, I think can make an adjustment and decide how they want to use that for their own organization. The reflective piece is also makes it very hard to ensure the validity. It's not impossible, but you need to do it. So we talk to our students about having validation groups, about making sure that they get critiques from other people, that having people push up on them and say, hey, you made the statement, where did that come from? Is that just your thought, or did you engage with other people to come to that kind of conclusion? So I think that's difficult. It makes action research actually one of the more difficult methodologies to use. Another disadvantage, I think, is that oftentimes in academia it gets some researchers might say that it's not a rigorous form of research. And I think that is in part because we have traditional ways of looking at research in academia that for many, many years, this is the ways in which research has been done. And so as academics and as students, we have to deal with that kind of pushback and just make sure that our work is that much stronger so that we can speak to the ways in which we're doing research that is valid and that is strengthened by the different points of contact that we have, not just us, but the peers and the supervisors and the people that we're working with. One thing I want to mention is the way that I view action research is that action research is really the methodological design. And in doing action research, you can still use quantitative and other qualitative methods within your design. So you might do surveys, you might do interviews. So action research isn't just a method that doesn't have these other kinds of methods in it. So it really makes for, I think, a really great way to have an experience of different kinds of research within one kind of design.
Great.
Yes, excellent points. I don't have much to add. I would just say from a faculty standpoint at an institution like many others that's increasing its research rigor, so to speak, there's a tension between doing more of this applied work versus me doing my own research, like for a community college, like if they wanted. So I think that's one of the questions that I think institutions and faculty members are struggling with. So it'll be interesting to see how that ends up playing out, because what I'm starting to see is more folks like us, Cheryl, who are tenured and who have been in the system for a while, we almost have the luxury to do this work. But if you're not tenured and there's a different metric being used for research and other types of scholarly productivity, it can be really challenging. From a student standpoint, I think a challenge they always have is students want predictability. Yeah. They want to know, like, if I set up an interview with 10 people, all 10 of them are going to show up 10 minutes early, you know, they're gonna be completely engaged, not be texting during the conversation. So for students, I think they find that challenging, but I think for us as faculty, it's great experience because they get to experience real life scenarios. But on the same token, we have to prepare them a little bit more for that lack of predictability, if you will. And I think for the professionals, it's a risk sometimes for some of them, especially if they haven't been through a student affairs program. I know that sounds surprising, but some of our VPs of student services have been faculty members or have come from the business world in this region. And so their understanding of students and project-based learning or action research sometimes looks really different. So that can be challenging at times, but it's something that's totally addressable in sort of educating some of our partners that we have to do in order to have these partnerships to do this work.
Yeah, and Erica, I want to sort of go off on something that you just said in that answer, and Cheryl is familiar with this conversation that we've been having, but it is really around institutional review boards or research boards and a lack of understanding of action research and at times navigating that, which has been a challenge at Cal Lutheran for some of our students.
Oh no.
In terms of putting in applications and faculty who serve on that board sometimes feeling as though there's coercion happening because you're in a role of authority. And so I'm curious, like, you know, one of the things that I'm sort of recognizing from the earlier part of our conversation is, you know, going back to the fishbowl that Cheryl's talking about, sort of owning sort of what your role is in that group, I think is an important piece that students, if they choose to do action research and needs to go through IRB, you need to be forthright and say, this is, I'm owning this, I'm owning that there is bias, I'm owning that there is a potential here. But are there other factors that you think students should maybe be considering in a naming or addressing as a part of some of this concern if they choose to?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great topic to talk about. I think faculty, we tend to do that individually or when something happens. So at my institution, it's very fascinating. So I've been at 4 different higher ed institutions, and this is the first one where my university IRB officer, and I go to her every year, does not require an IRB application. And I used to put it in anyway and just say, you know, please exempt us. And some of the community colleges require us to go through our own IRB first. But that's also very interesting, depending on the institution and the interpretation of what is or is not research. Some students might not have to go through with it. So because my students individually don't go through with it, it's kind of a second burden as a faculty member, which I'm okay with, right? It'd be nice if we get compensated more for that. But there are different checks that I put in for myself and also for the partner, so there's not undue harm. And one of them, which is probably really different than what I think I'm hearing, Cheryl and Dan, what you do in action research, is I actually don't allow students who work on that campus to participate in a group about that campus. So it eliminates that overlap. And the way I frame it to students is, what kind of experience do you want in graduate school? And so far, I haven't had one student come back and say, I really have to be a part of this project. I would say another benefit too is, more recently, a lot of our project partners are recent alums. And so they've gone through the process, like I don't have to sell them the process. And so that's been, again, another community building part, right? How wonderful is it to go through a program and then go back and sit on the other side as that practitioner main point of contact. So there's been a situation where one of the community colleges wanted us to go through this elaborate IRB, didn't accept our exemption that we went through, and then the community partner, who's an alum of the program, just kind of took the president aside and said, look, this is how I got my degree, and this is what I've learned. And so they were able to problem solve on our behalf. For individual students, I'm not as sure, but I would also say my institution is still growing in that research piece. Like, we have one IRB staff member and they're not full-time. So.
Yeah, and just for parameters, right? We have no professional staff in IRB. There is an IRB chair who gets one course release to do the work, and summer pay for administrative oversight. And so it is purely a faculty designated role. But again, different perceptions of what research is and how to complete research, and then a challenge just in terms of understanding educational research, particularly action research projects right now. We're trying to resolve that on our end as faculty and do some advocacy and some education, but these are some of the challenges that some of our past students have run into, certainly. Cheryl, any thoughts on that? I know you're muted.
Do it individually. We've talked about having sort of a one-pager. You know, we've gone back and forth with it. I kind of like that it's a pain, but I like that they each get the experience.
Yeah.
And that in class we talk about ethics, because in our situation they are doing it in their own, part of our program is all about them learning about themselves as professionals. So they are doing it in 70% of the cases in their own organization. Even though they may regret assistance, it is where they work. So we talk about the element of power. And everyone they work with gets a consent form. I mean, everyone that's participating in their work has to sign a consent form and approves that they're going to use their, that they present at the end. And some of them end up presenting at professional conferences. So we want them to be able to do that. And if they don't do an IRB, they can't do that at all. It is difficult when we go to like crossover, like we have someone at San Diego State, we have somebody at UCSD, and they have their own processes and they're different than ours. Ours is faculty driven. We have a in-house schools committee, volunteer, and then there's a university committee, and then it goes to the provost. So we have something, and this year for the first year it went online, which is great. So we're doing it all electronically. It's major. But I would say that our university has tried to support, for the most part. They don't all understand it, but they try to support the work.
So one of the things that, I trying to wrap my brain around, and as somebody who has done a tiny little bit of action research myself, I have done some self-studies of action research, and then also some of the collaborative, sort of more community-based, and oftentimes that self-study is a part of a community piece. But from your perspectives, can you talk a little bit about what the difference between a self-study is versus a larger sort of action research sort of paper article that somebody might read that says that they're using action research? Mm-hmm. Maybe Cheryl, if you want to start us off with this one.
Okay. I'm going to think of one while I'm talking because I've read so many. I'm just not thinking right away. But are the folks who are in our teacher ed program, they all, and our counseling programs, actually, we all do action research. So in the counseling program, they go to a school that they're not working at, and teams, sounds a little bit like Erica, and they inquire with that school, exact same way Erica does. What are some of the questions? What are some of the things that are happening here that you would like us to help you with? So you're an outsider coming in, and you're working with this community who has some concerns or some issues. You're developing the questions with them. And then you engage with them to develop a cycle. So we talk a lot about the cycles. And maybe they're having an issue with students who are absent too often, and they want to try to address that. So they might talk to the students, teachers, parents, and then they might develop a plan of action. And the plan of action might mean an after-school program of some kind, or something that would be appealing to the student, or before school, or something. And they go through with that action. And then they study that action. So how did it work? We're observing, we're talking with students, we're talking with parents as this action is going on, trying to understand if it's working or not, and if we need to make modifications. And so they're getting feedback from all of these different stakeholders in the process, in addition to their own, what I would say, felt sense of how it's going. That's where their individual piece comes in, to make some changes, to modify, to gather data and then make a modification and try it again. And that's where the cyclical process comes in. You try it again, what's working, what's not working. I mean, this process can go on and on. We hope that students see this as a part of their regular practice, that you try something out, you study it, you observe it, you make changes, and then you study it and you observe it again. I mean, we're all about assessment now in in this century, and they understand that assessment is important, and this is another formative assessment. They might do traditional surveys and interviews, but they're looking at the whole piece, not just that one piece, that just one method. They're looking at the whole picture. And I want to say something about what Erica said earlier, because I don't know if we'll come back to it. I sort of have a note about it later down the road, is the ambiguity. Mm-hmm. Because nothing ever turns out the way that you anticipated. And I always tell the students, you're going to get the exact experience that you need. So for the person who I said, if you send that email out to those 300 students, you might not get very many back, and they got 10 back because they didn't believe me. It's a wake-up call, not to believe your advisor, but to know that sometimes you have an idea about what students will do or how they'll respond, and it's not quite accurate. And so your best laid plans are likely, in 60% of the time, your plans change, which makes it a little more difficult for the IRB, because you have a plan, this is what you're going to do, and it often changes, which means they sometimes have to do addendums, which are very simple. But you have to go with what your community partners are saying to you. You can't get caught in, this is my research and I can't change it. You need to be open to those modifications, because it's all about listening to other people. And if they think that something's going to work better, you need to go with it, because it's not all about you in this case.
That's helpful and really important to note.
Yeah.
And that was an awesome example. I don't have anything to add other than at Seattle U, some students will do an internship. So we require 300 hours in addition to whatever GA-ship or full-time employment they have, and they can do it in 100-hour chunks and break it down if they'd like. And some students, especially the ones who are thinking of going to a doc program, we encourage them to do more of an action research-oriented project, so that they can experience the practitioner side and, get their feet wet too on the research end. And doc students, we have an EDD program. So before we moved to a group dissertation model. Don't ask me about it. But prior to that, and I'm finishing out some of those students, most of them end up doing action research because they're at a director level. I tend to work with a lot of community college administrators, so they're at a director or dean level and they want to move to a VP level. And so an action research project is one way that a couple of them have chosen to meet their academic and also their professional needs. So I would say there's that unique component too. although there are issues of power that come into play. But for the most part, it's a wonderful experience for all parties involved.
And again, I think, Erica, what you're naming of this, and we've talked throughout, it moves us into the next question. And we've talked about some of the ethical challenges involved in doing action research. But again, I think especially for folks at the beginning, it doesn't hurt to hear it one more time. So, and explicitly. So when we're thinking about the ethics involved in action research, what are some of the challenges that both of you sort of see that we need to be mindful of, things to sort of consider? And Erica, if you don't mind starting us off, that'd be great.
Sure. Since I guess I'm the designated IRB officer for these projects, I really do try to utilize the framework of do no harm. And at every level, whether it's to the student, to the community, to the institution. So every time a student comes up with an idea or a group comes up with an idea of, here's some information I want, or here's how I want to disseminate it, we have those discussions as part of our reflective paradigm, right? Like, what's the benefit, what's the harm, and how are you going to mitigate that piece so that it's embedded in part of the cycle that Cheryl spoke about. Another key component of the ethical piece, I think, especially for master's students that are doing this work, is how do you represent voice in an adequate way? And so there are two types of ethical representation issues that come up. One would be, the idea of actually sharing the narrative when it's a master's student doing it and having this power and ability to go into particular spaces like, a NASPA national conference, and quote unquote use a community voice to sort of elevate their own ambitions. So that's been really, really interesting. That's not an ethical issue that I thought would be something very big, but for students who are really thinking deeply about issues of power and privilege, that's a huge one, especially right now in our, hashtag all the things sort of phase. And students have been creative. Some students will put together videos or audio record and want to share so that they are not inauthentically, or they're checking their own power and privilege when they're representing voice. I think another ethical / bad research issue that comes up a lot is, and Cheryl, you talked about this a little bit earlier, is sort of generalizability. Sometimes students think, oh, well, we had a focus group of 10 students. That represents every community college student or every college student on this planet. And I think for some students, that's a really hard piece of learning. And when students, you ask them to really reflect. For some of my stubborn students, I'll say, go read an article, pick any article. Here are the 4 journals you can pick from, right? What do they say when they write up their findings? What words do they use? Do they say every student on this planet? And so it's an ethical issue for them to learn, but at the same time, it's also a research component. But it's something that I was pretty surprised with, especially more recently. Or they'll want to do a project to get every student on Earth. That's so unrealistic within an academic time frame, or any project without 100 people working on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. The other, I guess, one other thing I might add: the issue of power is really important, especially for us because they are doing this in their own areas. But something else that comes up is helping them understand the distinction between advocacy and research. So they have a question and they have something that's really important to them, and they go into their own work and say, this is, I've been feeling like this, and how do you feel, to an undergraduate student. So we have to help them understand that just because this is a burning issue for them and they see it this one particular way, that they have, and they feel very strongly about it, that they have to use language and techniques to help others explore the issue on their own. And they may not feel as strongly about it as you do, or they might not have the same feelings as you do. So how are you going to check yourself? And how are you going to have some of your peers check you when you start slipping into language that looks a little bit more like advocacy? The other piece that comes up all the time is the confidentiality. Because about half of our students do have grad assistant positions on campus. We're a small campus. Students all know each other. The master students know each other. The undergrad students know each other. So they're asking groups of students questions. And when they present their work, they also want to be authentic and present. But they sometimes can't say, well, the woman African American, because you're now outing somebody, basically, because they don't have an N of bigger than 2 or 3. So it's challenging. They want to hold people's confidence, but they also want to be able to let people's voices be heard. So we're always doing a little dance with that. And sometimes it's about the consent and what that looks like. So if they do a video, I think you were talking about videos before, we make sure that we put that on the consent form. So where on the consent form it says your identity is going to be, you'll use pseudonyms and your identity will be hidden, it's actually not going to be. We're going to show a video because we want your voice to be heard. So are you okay with that? So that, I think, it's a really important issue, combined with power and advocacy, that they have to really examine and explore once they start their research process.
That's great. And so this notion of power, both from an ethics standpoint, but also getting back to the larger question of reflexivity, is certainly an important piece. And so, just thinking for yourselves, how do you, thinking about your own work around action research, how does reflexivity play a role in that work in terms of analyzing data or even writing up data or presenting data? Whoever would like to start can start.
Go ahead, Erica.
Sure. So I was trained at UCLA. I worked at Harry. My advisor was Mitch Chang. So all quantitative all the time, right? How did I end up doing qualitative research and action research? I think the kind of questions I started to ask, and I'm all about process. I'm a very process-oriented person. And so I think for me, it's almost like I've gotten a second PhD in action research post my formal schooling. I started at a liberal arts school, Carleton College, and I had to change how I was doing research. And then I went to Texas State, where they wanted to grow a principal prep program into a P20 program. And so I was the higher ed person. So I was actually training principals in a very formal action research cycle, and then, bringing in students from community colleges and other higher ed contexts to try and bridge that gap. And so for me, I would say reflexivity, especially individual reflection, and also being in close community with other emerging practitioner scholars, whether they're professionals who are in graduate school or not, and really debriefing and trying to keep my biases in check when I do different projects is super, super important. And one technique that I use that my students see is I typically do a coffee meeting at a coffee shop across the street from campus, like a half day on a Friday. And they know, they're like, oh, I keep seeing all these people that, we're doing projects with. I'm like, yes, that's the other component of the work, sort of checking in, and then also sharing information back and forth.
Yeah, that's a hard question. That's why I passed the buck. Sorry, Erica. Yeah, so I've never done really a lot of traditional research, to be quite honest. And I came to my position in a very different way. I got my degree at USD, and I stayed there to work, which is unusual, I understand, but I came in the door a little bit differently. But to be honest, traditional research is just not for me. I understand that it's important, and I understand that it's needed. I understand that we have to do it, but it doesn't have I don't get the same kind of meaningful experience doing more traditional research. So the things that I have going now all have a reflexive component. Even if I'm doing qualitative piece, I just published something around a class that I do a lot of work around pedagogy. I always have a reflexive piece in there because that is just more meaningful for me, for where I'm at, in my career. I think for students, it is really all the things that Erica said. Yes, it's really important that they understand the distinctions and the value of doing work that you need to understand how to read quantitative, qualitative, doing a traditional research study that's quantitative. I mean, it's a lot shorter too, by the way. It's hard work, but it's a different kind of work. You're working with numbers, you're working with statistics. But being able to have that kind of thread through all of your experiences is really fantastic. And I think, my colleague, Dr. Christopher Newman, who you might know from UCLA, he had some of the same training that you did. And he's my colleague in higher ed, and we both review all the action research. And he brings in his perspective that's a little bit different from mine on some of the methods that they're using, which I really highly value. So we work as a team, and we try to make sure that students understand the differences, but are also able to flow in and out from surveys to interviews to the design methodology to do each of them justice. But for me personally, mostly the kind of work that I do now includes some kind of reflexivity within it.
When I appreciate both of you and sharing all of this. As Erica, you were talking about your second PhD in action research. To me, I think that's one great, and it certainly has come up from other people too, who have been graduates of UCLA and panels talking about how they've learned qual and sort of on their own, not having large data sets, purely quantitative, and having to sort of think on their own lines of inquiry in that sort of component. But that moves us to the next question too, and I do want to ask it because I think, thinking about the first time that you started an action research project to now, what has potentially shifted or changed for you in how you approach it, what you think about it, any of those pieces? Because I think, again, knowing the model and sort of reading it in a textbook and then actually doing it always are different things, right? Like you can read it, but until you do it, it's a different process. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and maybe Erica, if you don't mind starting us off on this.
Sure. I think one of the assumptions I made when I first started teaching and doing action research more was that, it's just a method, like learning quant, learning, how to conduct focus groups. Okay, it's just a method, and, you'll move on from it, and it won't change you. But I think now, at this point where I'm at now, I think action research to me is not just a method. It's not, I don't want to call it a pedagogy. I don't know, Cheryl, I'm curious to hear your thoughts, but to me, it's almost a lifestyle, because I use action research in everything that I do, not just in research in the classroom, but in the ways I make decisions at home. I'm currently writing a book with a practitioner, a full-time practitioner who doesn't have a doctorate degree, and hence how I know Chris and John were looking at place-based community engagement. And it's a completely new, this is my third PhD literally, because there's an actual dissertation we're co-writing together called a book. And it's just reframed the way that I think about problems of practice, how to engage with community. And this is a new one. And it also has colored what I think is a high quality professional, which is a little bit different. Because when you look at action research as just, just a method that you use once in a while, it there's a intersection with one's professional life. But I think now if I'm on a search committee, I want to know, I don't want to ask, oh, how do you work with an assessment person, or what's been your experience? Like, I'm looking for, okay, where's the reflection? How are they inclusive of community? So I'm looking for that reflexivity, that collaboration, and some of the principles of action research. So that's something newer that I'm starting to see that's really changed the way that I approach my work, period.
That's great, Erica. So I think I'm similar to you, although I probably didn't have as big of a stretch because I really wasn't traditionally trained, to be quite honest. So I see it as a living life as inquiry. You said it's at home. Yeah, it's a way of living. It's a way of a professional, and maybe need I say a spiritual practice. I mean, it's a way of being in the world where you live with questions, not answers. So you approach things with a sense of curiosity and openness. And when I first started doing action research was before I had tenure. And I was anxious because I was publishing things that were not traditional. And I always had my colleagues reviewing them, and they were giving, don't do this, don't do that. And so one thing that has changed now that I have tenure and I'm doing my own thing is I don't care so much about the criticism. I find my colleagues in places who appreciate this kind of work, and we do that kind of work together. So that has changed. But it's also changed the ways that I listen to people. So I mentioned earlier that I do a lot of self-study in relationship to my teaching because I value my teaching. But I'm more able to say bring in a doc student to work with me and have them engage in ways that maybe, I don't know, 8 or 9 years ago I couldn't do because I was more insecure myself. But now I'm secure, and I know that when Dan taught the college student development class with me, I know that he knew more about theory than I did. So I was really okay with opening our conversation about the class. What do you think we should do? And can you take the lead on this? And he might ask me a question. So it's teaching and working in a way that does embody collaboration and openness to learning. And it's frustrating for me sometimes that some faculty seem to think they have all the answers. And it's difficult for them to, for example, listen to the student affairs practitioners on campus. What do they know about, and I don't enter into conversations that way anymore. I don't, I know I don't have all the answers, and I want to hear from others who are different from me because I think they have a valuable insights that I may not have thought of. So really the whole process of developing as an action research practitioner scholar, I guess, has changed the way that I view my work and the way that I view my interactions with other people.
I really love that. Thank you. I mean, I think to me, I know I got the benefit from that perspective of philosophy, certainly during my time at USD and working with Cheryl as my chair, boss, advisor, guru. But I do love the concept that both of you, I think, are sharing of action research is a line of inquiry of just a life philosophy, and that there is the practice of meaning, deep meaning that's attached to this in profound ways in terms of professional life, but also personal life and all of that. And I think I can't help but also sort of think about the fact that each of us, it also are at religiously affiliated institutions, and how that sort of connection to around this practice is a piece that I think is really interesting, just in terms of how this plays out for us as practitioners and teachers, but also folks who are doing sort of thinking and research around these lines too.
Yeah,
I appreciate
that's a good point.
That's really interesting because this is my first and will probably be my last religiously affiliated institution. But I think what it has allowed is doing this work allows me to sort of address mission and teaching and everything that I do as a faculty member. So it's a neat opportunity. Even I'm not as connected to the religious or even the spiritual components of my campus, but there's still that value from the university to engage in this work. So
absolutely. And same, right? Like, I'm not Lutheran, but I love the fact that at a religiously affiliated institution, and that's part of what draws me, I think, to religiously affiliated institutions, that there is this interest in, often, I will put a caveat, often there is this interest in terms of meaning making that is coming from a place of inquiry, and also I do think reflexivity in terms of identity. And so I think that's really interesting. So I know that we're approaching our time, and I want to be conscious of that. So I want to move to our last question that I had posed. And so as students begin their work thinking about educational research in education, what advice would you give them to think about doing their work on master's theses or even projects down the line? And maybe, Cheryl, do you mind starting us off?
No, I think we've probably said pieces of this already, but the number one thing that especially for students who have done research before, because this it changes the paradigm for them. It's very hard for people who may have already done some quantitative research as an undergrads. It really is hard. But number one, I tell them to stay open, understand that this is going to get messy. And understand that the messiness and the ambiguity is part of the process. Like, that's actually something that you're going to use as data, that you'll be able to use that, what you might see as a mistake, what we would look then as, oh, wow, that's great. Now that gives you something to talk about, because how did that mistake happen? Or how did you run up against that? And what decisions would you make different? Who would you have included? So to be really open to seeing things in a different way, and not burdening yourself with all these mistakes that you're going to make along the way, because those are really great opportunities for learning. And the process is equally as important as the product. That's like a framing. Process is equally as important as the final product. And again, the question that I always tell them is, you're going to get exactly the experience that you need. Whether you're asking for it or not, you will get the experience that you need, and you'll make something of that experience, I promise. And you'll finish, and they all do. And there's times, while they're developing their questions for a semester, and then the next year they're working on their papers and their projects where they think they're not going to finish, but they all finish. I think we've had 2 that maybe haven't over the years, but encouraging each other, working together with peers is really important. They have study groups, and they stick together, especially when things get tough during the semester. Staying with it is sometimes difficult because it's a draining kind of research. It's not the thing that you walk away with because you're thinking about it all the time. It includes you in it, so it's a part of who you are. So just to stick with it and stay open.
I really appreciate that, Cheryl, because I just got finished reading the first papers, which are research biographies for our students in the classes. And, at least one of the students in my section wrote how that there was a sort of a traumatic undergrad research experience where she was working in a faculty member's lab and got things wrong, and then ended up feeling like she had to quit and leave the lab because of that experience, and how now sort of there is this worry that she's going to make mistakes, or that there's going to be mistakes made in this process, and not wanting to just screw anything up. And I think that reminder of mistakes are part of the process, and they're important learning opportunities, and especially within action research, that's where that's data, right? Again, you're naming that. And I think that's just an important reminder that even if it's not action research, that's data. And there are ways to amend always a project and go through. It's not ever super hard and fast, so I think that's really helpful. Erica.
Yes, you all shared excellent points. I tell students typically to get your shovel, you're going to be digging deep, to be brave. And I don't mean this in the way of, go out and fail intentionally, but I tend to tell students, like, what would you do if you know that you couldn't fail, right? Because you're going to learn about yourself, you're going to learn about community, you're going to learn about the profession in the process. So what would you do? And then finally, do your own work. Throughout the process, you're going to be challenged, and it's not going to be about changing the institution or being the VP, but you're going to have to relook at yourself, who you are, what you stand for, when you will speak up or you don't. And I think for students, that could be really, really terrifying at times. But Cheryl, you mentioned earlier the fine line between advocacy. And I think for some students, even thinking that they can be an advocate in that way is both inspiring as part of action research, but also challenging.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know that I have been writing a whole bunch of notes and ideas throughout our conversation of different things that I'm like, you know what, I totally want to do that. I need to think about embedding this as a class assignment or different components. And quite honestly, I'd already been thinking about some of those, but it just reinforces and reinvigorates me to keep thinking about my own pedagogy, the different ways that we can sort of do this and familiarize our students right from the start around thinking of themselves as scholar practitioners in really thoughtful, meaningful ways through action research. And so I'm deeply appreciative of your time and what you've shared. I know that the students will really take a lot from it as well. So thank you both for everything that you've given to us today.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.